like Church Hospital, I no dey able to afford the fees where then they pay for good day for see doctor for self. The money I know they afford am. Pass like I go to the poor hospital. We are in this all not for B.
هذاك اللي معذبنا فهمتي هذاك اللي معذبنا تري غيرك عايش ياكل ويسرق وكاسي راحة تاني سوى تو قداش هذا ما سمعت النهار وغيري كيف ثم الناس بس كيف.
Pues ya casi no nos ven igual, no nos ven igual como una persona normal. Siempre caminas con eso de que siempre te van a señalar, de que no te van a aceptar. Y a pesar de que ya han afectado muchas cosas, a una gente aún así te baja el autoestima muchas veces.
Women don't get paid half as much as men. There's a really bad gap in between what a woman makes and what a man makes. And then not just that, then people don't hire you depending on your name. If they see your name on a resume, we're not going to hire them.
Ya, y la confianza que yo me aspiro a mí, digamos, para ellos es lo que me ayudaron. Digamos, solo el apoyo que tuve con ellos de que me ayudaron, que un préstamo que me hicieron por lo mismo, por lo que perdí mi casa por la pandemia, como les expliqué. Entonces, aún así me ayudaron con un préstamo en el banco. Entonces, gracias a ellos he tenido internet, tengo mi laptop, que es la que utilizo para mis trabajos.
Corruption. If that stop totally entirely, it could be me to back more.
Yo lo que diría es que tratemos de ayudarnos unos a otros sin importar color de piel, ni color de pelo, ni nada. O sea, que no importe la religión, ni el sexo, ni nada de eso, ¿verdad? Que todos nos apoyemos a lo como somos.
My advice what they give to my fellow Sierra Leoneans, let we embrace one another. Let we avoid bots, badats, tribalism, politics. Let we say we all are brothers and sisters.
Hello and welcome to Delivering the UN Common Agenda Action to Achieve Equality and Inclusion. I'm Shakuntala Santharan. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities within countries and between nations in a wide range of areas, from healthcare to technology. These inequalities are felt along various lines, from ethnicity to gender to income. In the last 18 months alone, 120 million more people have fallen into poverty. 114 million people have lost their jobs. At the same time, the world's billionaires have seen their wealth rise by over $4 trillion to $13 trillion. COVID vaccines are being wasted in some countries and are in desperately short supply in others. With the spotlight on these inequalities, what are some countries doing to try and remedy this? The answers aren't easy or perfect, but as you'll see, where there's the will, change is possible. Reducing inequality is vital to ensure more stable growth, to contain this and future pandemics, and to tackle the climate crisis. We'll be looking at solutions that work in a new report titled From Rhetoric to Action, Delivering Equality and Inclusion. This is the flagship report of one of the sponsors of today's event, the Pathfinders Grand Challenge on Inequality and Exclusion, a coalition of governments, civil society organizations, and international experts. Many thanks to Canada, Sweden, and the Open Society Foundations for supporting this work. Pathfinders is part of New York University's Center on International Cooperation. This event is also sponsored by Leaders Network, Reinforcing Multilateralism Together, an informal group of nations who are committed to international cooperation and also to the UN Common Agenda. That's the UN Secretary General's vision of how multilateral cooperation can evolve to better tackle the challenges and threats of the 21st century. We brought together leaders from Pathfinder nations, civil society organizations, the UN, and the private sector, individuals with vital different roles who play an important part working together to try and bring about change. It is time now for some words of welcome from the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, to the Instituto Cervantes here in New York City. Prime Minister Sanchez.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. For me, it's a pleasure to host this very important meeting in Instituto Cervantes, which is an institution created to promote Spanish. And I do believe that the major question and challenge that we need to face in the coming years is the question of equality and inclusion, social inclusion.
Let's kick things off now with our first panel discussion. We have with us the President of Sierra Leone, Julius Maada Bio. We have also with us the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, Winnie Byanyima, who's Executive Director of UNAIDS. She's a self-described grassroots fighter who's never accepted inequality since she was a child. And also with us, Mark Malloch Brown, who's president of the Open Society Foundations. That's the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us in person. We have a lot to discuss in a very short amount of time. So if we could start with you, please, President Bio. Sierra Leone has come a long way since the civil war in your country. A lot of progress has been made on poverty, on tackling education, and also health. But then the pandemic hit and has made inequalities worse, as the UN Common Agenda has highlighted. How has the pandemic affected Sierra Leone's plans and progress on tackling inequality and inclusion, or rather exclusion?
Definitely, the pandemic has affected our growth or our movement to getting equity. We had just come out of the Ebola, and we are still having a lot of difficulties trying to reconstitute our health system. The economy was still struggling. We were struck by mudslide soon after that, a huge mudslide. And of course, with the combination of all of these, the pandemic has only exacerbated our situation as a nation. So we know it's a health emergency with serious economic implications. And of course, we have not been able to increase our revenue intake. In fact, it has been reduced very, very drastically. But we have started our human capital development program as a nation. My government is paying much more, has put premium on human capital development, health, agriculture, and education. So without the requisite amount of money to actually continue this, it has affected us. But what we have tried to do is not to use COVID as an excuse. So in fact, instead of reducing our surge, moderating it, we have increased the number of kids going to school by 800,000. We continued all our schools, the exams we are taking, and we use radio and other media to reach out to kids all over the country. We think we could have done better had it not been for the coming of COVID. So I will say categorically that COVID definitely has had an impact, but we have refused to accept this, because there is always an excuse for not doing much. And I have to go back to my people. I have to make sure that we genuinely move the clock towards going to where we want to go.
Prime Minister Sanchez, in his UN Common Agenda, the Secretary General has called for a new social contract, and on a local, national, and global level. What does that mean to you, and what would a new social contract look like for Spain?
Well, it means many things, no? I say that, for instance, this social contract will mean an international treaty of pandemics. I think that, as I said before, it is important to share knowledge, to share information, to put in common when we face and we need to respond to an unknown virus for the science. I think it's very important what Bio says about not using the pandemic as an excuse, but to accelerate many changes and transitions that we need to face, ecological transition, for instance, or the digital transformation, giving an integrative and inclusive perspective, not only a social inclusiveness, but also territorial inclusiveness, gender inclusiveness, and intergenerational perspective in order to create opportunities among our youth population. So just to mention one angle of your question, I would say it is important to take out some lessons, and one is that we need to strengthen our common response to future pandemics, for instance, with an international treaty of pandemics.
Winnie, you've been fighting inequality your whole life. Why is it so important to reduce inequality and exclusion? And why is it such a central issue for people in their everyday lives?
Thank you, Shaks, and it's an honor to be on this panel. You know, people have been losing power for a very long time. In the last decades, we've seen democracy lose ground. Inequality growing, extreme inequality growing to a point where it's now a global crisis. COVID-19 has exposed and worsened existing inequalities. But over the last 40 years, the truth is that a few people were making better and better for themselves at the cost of the rest of the world. To such an extent that in 2019, 26 billionaires owned more wealth than the bottom half of humanity, 3.9 billion other people. That is how bad the inequality was and continues to grow. So when power and wealth, political power and wealth, are concentrated in the hands of a few, that's a crisis of democracy. Public policies fail to meet the needs of ordinary people. That is the crisis we are in. So for me, extreme wealth is dangerous, and the idea of a renewed social contract is actually the idea of recalibrating, reducing those inequalities, and reducing and attacking the very structures in the economy that allowed this to happen. So what would we need to do? We would start now with the burning issues, and there are two for me that are burning today. One is the terrible inequality regarding access to the COVID-19 vaccines. President Sanchez has just mentioned 75% of the people in his country have been vaccinated. In my country, Uganda, it's about 1%. This is how bad the inequality is. And it isn't just bad for people who don't have it, it's bad for the whole world, because we know that more and more dangerous variants are being created when people are not vaccinated. Secondly, we know that the whole global economy is losing trillions of dollars. In fact, I have a figure that is so interesting, which is that the cost of vaccinating the whole world is 4 times less than what the world is losing by not vaccinating. So it doesn't make economic sense. So to me, dealing with that issue, that inequality, closing that gap, and secondly, closing the gap on taxation. until we also close the tax loopholes that deny countries the revenues they need to solve problems of health and education,
Yes.
we're still in trouble.
We're going to be
So those
looking-
are the two.
Thank you, Winnie. We're
Yeah.
going to be looking at that tax issue actually in our second panel, and a little later on today on inequality to vaccine access is one of the issues we'll be addressing. Mark, you helped to devise the Millennium Development Goals while you were head of the UN Development Program. What do you make of the UN Common Agenda? Do you think it's achievable?
I think it's ambitious and absolutely necessary, which is to duck the answer whether it's achievable or not, because it needs to be done, and the world needs to show the kind of solidarity that our two leaders here have indicated they support. But this is a moment of a very fragmented United Nations, and I am one who thinks that the concept of a social contract could be the golden thread that sort of restores a sense of legitimacy and purpose to multilateralism. And therefore, I'm hugely in favor of the attempt. And I also noticed that in a way, the Secretary General implicitly is bypassing a lot of the existing structures of the UN with the proposal for a series of summits. Well, actually, what allowed us to do the MDGs was a series of summits which preceded it on social and education and the environment, the summits of the 90s. They laid the groundwork for the world to come together around the Millennium Development Goals. I mean, I'm always fond of saying, we wrote them in a basement room in the UN and sprung them on a surprised world. But in truth, there was that sort of legitimacy building through summits. So, while summits in an era of COVID and limited travel seems a hugely complicated thing to do, jamming up New York with more limos for more time, whether it is virtual or real, the idea of getting world leaders together around these issues and driving agreement, outside the broken structures of the Security Council or the General Assembly, is ambitious, but very, very necessary.
Let's take a look now at some specific examples of action being taken to reduce inequality that are showing visible results in people's lives. Back to you, President Bio. According to the Pathfinders research that reports, for people in Sierra Leone, the COVID pandemic has been maybe a little less so about a health crisis and even more so an economic crisis. Sierra Leone, as you mentioned earlier, Sierra Leone unveiled a new direction development plan when the pandemic started. What does the plan do to reduce inequality and exclusion, to make a real difference for people in Sierra Leone?
The medium-term national development plan that you're referring to is actually education for development. I believe that education is a great instrument, a navigating instrument that is a universal key. And we have realized that 3 out of 5 Sierra Leoneans cannot read or write, which means we are not ready for development of any sort. And in that statistics, you also realize that women, we are not involved at all, but a very small group of them. So what we did was we launched a free quality education program under which every child born in Sierra Leone today has free access to preschool, primary, secondary, and for the girls, actually, they have 17 years of free tuition access, because they can actually go to university if they are doing science, and it's the government that is paying for them. What we want to do is to close the gap. We realized that girls were lacking behind. After 6th grade, there was gender parity, but beyond that, only 1 out of 5 we go to university. So we are trying to bridge that gap. We have also done what we call radical inclusion. Girls were banned from going to school once they are pregnant. And I think that is secondary victimization, because responsible people for the most time are responsible for the pregnancy. So what we have done is we have completely banned that also, and when girls, we help them not to be pregnant. We talk to them. My wife goes out, has a big national program called Hands Off Our Girls, which because of that we have brought in an act of parliament which really makes sure that society recognizes the need for us to give chance to these girls to grow up and to nurture them. So in the radical inclusion, even kids who are disabled have free access. So only in Sierra Leone you have 17 years of free access to education for girls who are going to do sciences, and for the boys they have at least 12 years of free quality education.
Prime Minister Sanchez, I believe education was also another area that
Absolutely.
Spain has been looking at. I'm going to quote this statistic from the Public Library of Science Open Journal. It estimates that inequality in Spain in the pandemic would have risen by almost 30% in just 1 month without government intervention. So what action has your government been taking, and what else are you planning to do?
Well, we had a plan, first of all, resistance, then reactivation of our economy, and then, the transformation, the modernization of our economy. One of my biggest obsession is to explain to people that these twin revolutions, the ecological transition and the digital transformation, are a huge opportunity for prosperity, and not another excuse for, the exacerbation of inequalities in our country. That is why, for instance, regarding the ecological transition, by 2022, we're expecting to close 85% of our coal capacity. What we are doing is to speak with stakeholders of the territory, with also the trade unions, the enterprises, in order to reach just transition agreements. And this is, creating a very positive synergies and dynamics in the territory. Also, what we did on the digital side, the digital transformation, is to launch public consultations with stakeholders in order to draw a kind of a charter of digital rights, algorithms, non-discrimination, artificial intelligence. So the people see that this digital transformation is for good. So I think it's very important to, because in the end the private sector already is investing on the ecological transition and the digital transformation. What we have to do from our side, the political side, is to create a cohesive perspective of these two twin revolutions.
Winnie, you've said before, and I quote, "Inequality is not inevitable. Inequality is the result of public choices. If governments make different public choices, we can reduce extreme inequality. What we need is their commitment." Are President Bio and Prime Minister Sanchez demonstrating that kind of commitment?
Absolutely. And that's why they are part of this Pathfinders project. And that's why I'm also in it, because this is a group that is passionate and understands why inequality is dangerous for humanity and is determined to do something about it. You see, inequalities of power and wealth by the big pharma companies that now own this vaccine technology, and the richest countries that have bought and are helping themselves, the inequalities between them and the rest of the world are behind this problem we have. Yet we know that unless we tackle them, we will not end the COVID pandemic and we will not get back to recovery as a whole world. the data point I wanted to share with you is this one, that it's estimated that getting vaccines to our failure to get vaccines to everyone in the world is costing the global economy $2.3 trillion. That is 33 times more than it would cost to vaccinate everyone.
That's a
It's-
shocking
it-
statistic.
yeah, it just doesn't make economic sense. So the failure to ensure vaccination for everybody in the world, the consequences of new variants, of sinking economies in the developing countries, all of that high cost could be avoided by reducing that inequality of access to vaccines. So we've seen this before. 12 million lives in the South were lost when they could have been saved because they were antiretrovirals, but they were costing $10,000 per person. The technology was held by a few companies in the North. And until the world came together and we shifted to generics produced in the South, today it costs $75 a year. And everyone in different countries can have it priced differently depending on the income of the country. This is a story of success that could be repeated today if we tackle inequalities.
Mark, the pandemic does not look like it's going away anytime soon. Does the current crisis actually present an opportunity? Is there an increased will to try and affect change as the pandemic exacerbates these inequalities?
Well, Winnie and I debate this a lot between ourselves, and there should be an opportunity because this is one of those moments of crisis where Big Pharma should be put in a half Nelson and its head put under a tap until it agrees to release drugs at marginal prices, or indeed to share, more importantly, the intellectual property rights. But this is very different moment to the moment when we faced a similar crisis over AIDS, when Kofi Annan was Secretary General and I was one of his lieutenants. Kofi, gentleman that he was, married to a Swede. They're why, so kind-hearted. But he did just that. He called in Big Pharma and he said, "We're going to waive trips. We will have generic producers making these drugs." Now, it's a bit more complicated this time because the drug technology really does need the cooperation of Big Pharma to make it. But there's just not nearly enough toughness. I heard Pfizer being congratulated by President Biden today for providing doses for the US to distribute. It's okay, but this is the weakest solution of all. We need to go so much further. And, I just feel the leadership there and the anger is not there. And, I have put together with fellow presidents of foundations, a grouping of foundations to press for jabs in arms and economic recovery over the next 12 months, because so many lives are at risk because of this. And I think one of the roles foundations need to play, and a human rights one like ours perhaps particularly, is to act as a foundation of conscience, to say to the world, for goodness sake, stand up and be counted on this and deliver. And to listen to those little girls struggling for a place in school in Sierra Leone, and to know that the world isn't standing by to make sure their teachers and parents are vaccinated so that the school system in Sierra Leone can work effectively. It's the great betrayal of conscience, the great betrayal of any prospective social contract of our generation.
Absolutely.
The Pathfinders report highlights vaccine equity as one of the key international policies that are critical to aid national action, to complement national action, access to finance as well. President Bio, Sierra Leone has managed to vaccinate just 0.5% of its population, according to the last figures that I checked. Maybe you have more latest figures. It's also had to borrow more to cope with the effects of the pandemic. How important are these two things for your country? Access to money and vaccines. Are you getting international help?
We are getting some help. through the COVAX facility. We've had some vaccines from the US, France, China, but we have not even done up to 1% of our population at the moment. And we are very eager to do that so that we can return to normality. But with the absence of that, and we know how important the vaccines are for us to really resume full economic activity, which should be our preoccupation. We are a government that is struggling. We have to make sure that we have to go again and borrow because our revenue is not performing. Activities have been slow. And of course, it has disrupted supply chains from around the world. So prices are almost doubling with deteriorating exchange rate in our country. It's even worse. We have struggled quite a lot with this explanation for the richer nations to understand the need for us to put our debt aside for now. Because, for instance, we use 70% of our monthly revenue coming in to just pay for the public service teachers and all the other things. The other 30%, 20% goes into just debt servicing. We are left with only 10% to fulfill our social pledges. It is extremely tight. The fiscal margin is so tight, we can hardly do anything to improve. But because we are committed, we have put aside 22% of our budget just to education, because we know that this is going to narrow the gap. I mean, we want to equip every child today in Sierra Leone with the navigational tools to be able to navigate the 21st century, especially with the looming fourth industrial revolution, which is going to require a totally new set of skills. So in terms of closing the gap, we don't want to use, we are not accepting anything. Even in the face of COVID, we are still committing 22% of our budget and making sure that it doesn't matter where you come from. The guards are giving more support today. We have introduced gender empowerment and equity policies just to make sure that the women are with this. We are even giving out loans, social safety loans to women, just so that when they can support the homes. And during the lockdown, we had few lockdowns of about 3 days. We identified the vulnerable groups and we gave them food and money just to keep going. So these are the little things that can reduce the exclusion and also get everybody to know that they are part of the society.
Prime Minister Sanchez, how much can governments do alone, whether it's vaccines or economic recovery? How much international cooperation is needed?
Well, I think there are two examples. The first one, I think, is the common purchase of vaccines that the European Union made, not only to purchase those vaccines, but also to anticipate resources to the companies in order to speed up the process of investigation. And then redistribute it among our population proportionally to each member state. And the second one, well, my country, Spain, is the second largest car producer in the European Union. So now we are moving towards the electric car. And that is why, it is important to create this public and private partnership between the central government, regional governments, and also the car industry, the digital industry, and the renewable energy companies.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to jump in here because we're actually running out of time. It's gone very quickly. Mark, I needed to ask you about the summit that you mentioned just now, that global, I'm going to read this, COVID-19 summit, Ending the Pandemic and Building Back Better, which was just held by the US. You attended this. What happened? Was it a success?
Well, look, I mean, it's fantastic that President Biden did it, and fantastic that so many leaders came, and the US now lifted its commitment to 1.1 billion doses. Chinese president, who very obviously didn't go, but nevertheless yesterday committed to 2 billion doses. So the numbers are starting to mount, but they're just still, despite the best efforts of everyone who spoke, which was an appropriate cross-section of civil society leaders, health leaders, as well as government leaders, there still isn't the plan to deliver this result against a deadline, properly resourced, and nor is there a plan to deal with the fact that this isn't just a public health crisis, it's a prospective looming economic crisis, a debt crisis in many developing countries, and certainly a sort of output and jobs crisis in many countries. And that sort of plan and collaboration is elusive. And we come back to the Secretary General's bravely proposed social contract. If ever there was a place for that contract to begin, it is in the ashes of today's crisis, to build back from this ruinous situation, which is more than a public health crisis. It's this breakdown of international collaboration and international fraternity and solidarity. So, let's hope that what President Biden did today was his first small step towards a world coming together around this.
I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. I wish we could continue talking, but we have run out of time. Thank you so very much for sharing your ideas, experiences, and commitments. Today also marks the launch of the Pathfinders flagship report. Here's a summary of that report.
During the first year of COVID-19, billionaires saw a 54% increase in wealth, equivalent to more than $4 trillion, whereas 120 million more people were pushed into extreme poverty, an unprecedented increase. There is no doubt inequalities are hampering the progress of humanity. So, is inequality here to stay? Not necessarily, but to address this, we need to fully understand it. Let's look at some data. 80% of the public we've surveyed feel there are divisions in society affecting the way we live together. The vast majority think these divisions create tensions, and countries are doing too little about it. Most people are bothered about the rich not paying enough tax, and the majority feel that governments are largely influenced by wealthy individuals, interest groups, or businesses, and people like them are not listened to. It can feel like change isn't possible, but some countries have been trying new things. In Sierra Leone, community justice organizations deployed paralegals in remote and marginalized communities to help support people resolve disputes, from debt to family problems. In the USA, extra welfare support for the poorest meant that poverty fell in record numbers during the pandemic. And in Costa Rica, a national conversation was launched to ensure even the most marginalized were heard. Across the world, policies are making a difference. And according to our research, the most important policies to deliver are those that create visible change, for instance, by increasing access to affordable housing, build solidarity between groups through social dialogue tools, secure credibility by addressing corruption so the rich no longer rig the system, and work internationally to provide debt relief to the poorest countries. Without tackling policies like these, we cannot fix other global problems, including the climate crisis. But our research shows we can start the process of healing, not only from the 2020 global pandemic, but decades of division and rampant inequality.
And there were some really shocking statistics in that video, and also some cause for hope. With us now are Sarah Kliff, who is New York University Center on International Cooperation's director, and also Dr. Faiza Shaheen, the lead author of that report. Thank you very much for joining us today. Sarah, if we could start with you, please. Why did you launch this initiative? Why this report, and what are you hoping to achieve with it?
So this report came about because our partners said to us, we have all this work going on analysing the problem of rising inequality and exclusion, but we really don't have work on solutions. What are we supposed to do? So governments, for instance, coming newly into office would say to us, we want to do something. We really want to do something to reduce inequality and exclusion. But the solutions that we have proposed to us are contested, or they're impractical, or they're not politically viable. So what they asked us to do is to put together some work on the evidence for what works, what solutions can really deliver. Our civil society partners were then also really enthusiastic about that, and that's how the initiative was born.
Got it. Faiza, if we could come to you now. In your own words, could you tell us what the report does?
Yes, so the report really does present that change is possible. It shows the solutions. And one of the things we were really careful to do was in presenting the solutions. And the solutions, they vary from the sorts of typical things you might think of when you think of inequality, so tax and redistribution, but also things like housing, care, the visible change that people want to see in their lives. And then also goes on to look at things like how you tackle corruption and how you build solidarity and empathy between groups. And the reason we did that in the way that we did was because we also had in mind that it was governments and civil society actors that had asked us to do this work. It's not just about technically how we can do, one change in tax. It's about a strategy for change and how we bring people with us, right? So those of us that have been political actors and we knock on doors and make the argument on the doorstep, we've got to be able to sell what we're doing. We've got to think about the way in which we're sequencing policies, for instance, communicating policies. So that's all here in this report. So we're really hoping that this is a policy toolkit for people that can, that are there making the decisions on policy change, but also is an advocacy tool for civil society actors and the public.
Faiza, what's new in the report?
So there's a couple of things that really stand out to me, and I've written a lot of reports on inequality, and I have to say there is a lot of new things in this report. So a couple of things. One is the diversity of countries involved. This is not just low-income countries, not just high-income countries. It's low, middle, and high-income countries. And one of the things, honestly, I enjoyed the most was reading the transcripts of interviews from people around the world and hearing again and again that people are upset about inequality, that they want things to change, then reacting in very similar ways to statements about how the system is rigged. So that is in here, and you can see that, the polling, the sense of unity about that inequality. And the second big thing is really that policy framework. And when we looked at the research or we spoke to people, or we looked at the countries that were doing well versus the countries that were actually seeing inequality get worse, we saw these three areas of action. Visible change. People need to feel that their lives are materially changing. And that is about income, but that's also about things like housing. It came up again and again. It's really a point of conversation, but also the care economy. Women, how are you going to have gender equality without addressing how the care sector works? So that's the visible actions. We heard that people want to get on. They're worried about divisions in their society. So our polling found that 4 in 5 people are worried about those divisions, and they think governments should be doing more. So how you build solidarity, there's social dialogue tools you can use, the ways in which you can address prejudices in society. And then thirdly, corruption, what you do to build credibility in government. What do you do on trust? So corruption is a big part of that, but so is financing. So we bring those things together and we really actively look at how those things link. And we do say to government, civil society actors, anyone looking at this problem, that you have to consider each of these three areas. And that's new.
So as Faiza said, the report covers a very diverse range of countries. How is this report relevant to all these different country situations? We've got Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, Sweden, and Spain, among others.
So it's really a menu of options, first of all. It's not a boilerplate set of solutions, because each country has their own circumstances, their own political dynamics, their own priorities. But we were astonished to find how much commonality there was across countries. And let me give 2 or 3 examples. One is what Faiza just said about housing. that I might have expected before we did this research that was more of a rich country grievance in Sweden or South Korea, for instance. But we found in all the countries covered that this sense people had of rising house prices, difficulty of young people accessing housing in urban areas was really shared. Second is building solidarity. You think about this sometimes as an issue for countries coming out of conflict or authoritarian rule. But in fact, we see that in most high-income countries today, most middle-income and low-income countries, there's that sensitivity, that worry about tensions and polarization. That was shared. And third, as Faiza said, building trust through acting against corruption. So showing that the action we need from governments is done in a way that is clean and that builds trust with people. That also was very common across countries. There's a lot of learning also between developing and developed countries. So some countries are better on issues like those solidarity building experiences. Some countries have experience of delivering visible results or tax reform or those things.
Sarah and Faiza, thank you so very much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
Sarah Cliff and Faiza Shaheen.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Handing over now to my co-moderator, Trisha Shetty, who's based in India. She'll be speaking to a Nobel laureate, economist Joseph Stiglitz, as well as Gabriela Buscher, who's with Oxfam, among others, to find out what specific policies are needed to effect real change. I'll be back a little later with our final panel discussion, which includes the President of Costa Rica and the Prime Minister of Sweden. So please do stay tuned for that. For now, it's over to Trisha.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Trisha Shetty, and I am incredibly honored today to be joined by Dr. Veera Songwe, as well as Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, who prefers to be addressed as professor. So I'm just going to get right to it and give a brief introduction to the incredible people that we have here. Professor Stiglitz is an American economist and professor at Columbia University, and no big deal, also a Nobel laureate. He is known for pioneering work on asymmetric information, income distribution, public policy, macroeconomics, globalization, and has written many books. One of the recent titles being People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, and has been calling for people to get radical on inequality way before it became an important talking point for millennials and Gen Z. So thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for joining us today. We also have the incredible Dr. Veera Songwe, who's the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. And drumroll, the first woman to lead this institution in its 60-year history. Dr. Songwe's reforms have focused on ideas for a prosperous Africa and has focused on critical issues of macroeconomic stability, development finance, private sector growth, poverty, and inequality. So between the two of you, we have an incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise, and we cannot wait to tap into it. We are gathered here today to talk also about a really important report that has been published by Pathfinders called From Rhetoric to Action, Delivering Equality and Inclusion. So I encourage you all to go have a deep dive to that report, which will be available on the Pathfinders website. And when you tune in and have any questions for Dr. Songwe or Professor Stiglitz, please feel free to tag SDG 16, that's the number 16, 16+ on Twitter, and engage in this conversation with us. Okay, so first question. The report that's launched today advocates for greater investment in people's material conditions for visible change, which includes affordable housing, the green sector, digital connectivity. Professor Stiglitz, you have referred to this in the past about the dichotomy presented, when people talk about the economically advantaged and disadvantaged. It's not really on, who's hardworking or not. You've spoken about wealth gains from capital gains on land. So could you elucidate more on that? For those who are still stuck on the rhetoric of if only they were more hardworking. And critically, what is the current role of Western or developed economies, if you may, in addressing this issue?
Yeah, well, so first, I think there are a couple basic principles that one has to understand. And there's, unfortunately, a lot of misunderstanding. Over the last 40 years, a prevalent idea has been trickle-down economics. You just throw enough money at the rich, everybody will benefit, it will trickle down. Hasn't happened. There was never any theory or any evidence behind it. The second idea is that we have to recognize that a lot of the inequalities in our society have to do with power relationships, with discrimination. You mentioned this idea that if you just work hard, well, what we have evidence of that. The life prospects of even a young American, and America thinks of itself as a land of opportunity, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in any of the other advanced countries. And the fact that there are such large differences is the third point I want to make. Public policy makes a difference. What governments and society do really do change the opportunities that individuals have. They affect what you get from working hard, whether you reap the rewards or whether you don't. Now, in terms of the concrete actions, the report focuses on the concrete actions. My view is very strongly, you have to do everything. It's not education or health or food or housing. If we're going to address these issues, you have to do all of the above. One of the things that we've seen so clearly in the United States in the last actually few months is that if the government takes strong actions and addresses the material conditions, it can rapidly make a difference. In the United States, the Biden Recovery Plan is in the process of reducing the number of children in poverty by some 50% in 1 year. And what that shows is, what I sometimes put it is, inequality is a choice. Poverty is a choice. We didn't have to have this degree of inequality. We don't have to have this degree of poverty if we make a public commitment to do something about it. And that's why this moment of COVID-19 and recovery, where we're reflecting on what this nasty disease has done to our society, is so important. We should use this moment to ask the question, now that we've gone through this experience, where do we want to go in the post-COVID world?
Thank you so much for that. I will press you on a few other questions around that. But Dr. Songwe, often when you talk about the African continent, the narrative is shaped around beneficiaries of aid, right? But we've seen incredible success stories coming out of the African continent and lessons that other countries can learn. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think one of the things that this crisis has shown us, and I want to talk about three things. I think Professor Stiglitz talked about dichotomy, and I'm talking about dynamic divergence. And essentially what we have seen is a world where, we have a global pandemic. It's a global commons, it's a global bad, but the world has reacted to it differently. I think the world has never been more nationalistic than we have been at this period. But maybe the good thing that has come out of this is that we are able to then understand where our strengths are, and our being the global hour, but in particular for Africa, to come to your question, I think one of the things that has happened is exactly as Professor Stiglitz said, the choice that we've always had of waiting for the West to react for Africa when there was a crisis, when there was a debt crisis, when there was the Ebola crisis, we didn't have that choice because everybody was so panicked. The West was shut down. People were still trying to understand what was happening to them, let alone go worry about, countries far afield. So very quickly, what Africa did was we came together and we created pooled platforms to respond to this crisis. The first pooled platform that we created was something called the African Medical Supplies Platform. And very quickly, Africa was able to have access to PPEs, equipment that was needed for this crisis. If you remember, there were stories about the United States diverting PPEs that were meant for Canada because the United States didn't have enough PPEs. But I think that was the first lesson, was if Africa came together and pulled its resources and pulled its knowledge, we could actually come to grips with that. So we did that first. But then the second thing I think that came out of this was very quickly, when we had vaccines, and an amazing, feat of science, right? It was to so quickly, come out with these vaccines and even discover new types of vaccines. Now we're all talking about the mRNA vaccines as if we've always lived with them, but this is an invention of the COVID period, and thank God for that, because now maybe we can actually do other things. But then again, this notion of Africa as the donor destination, right? There was very quickly the donor community came together and said, oh, let's go help Africa, or let's promise that we will help Africa, right? And so we created the COVAX system that said, we will help Africa. But again, what we saw there was saying, yes, we'll help Africa, but we'll help Africa by using somebody else. So we got, Serum Institute of India to be the one that provides vaccines for Africa. Of course, Serum Institute of India never provided vaccines for Africa as quickly as we wanted, because everybody needed those vaccines. So another conversation that we've always had, and Professor Stiglitz is very familiar with this with the terminology I'm about to use, is we've always said to Africa, oh, you need to level the playing field in your economies, because it's only after you level the playing field that the rest of the world can grow. If there was one thing we did not do during the COVID crisis, is we did not level the playing field for the world. Africa was left to wait. We were sort of said, wait, let's vaccinate each other. Wait, let's do trips. Let's close our export markets. Let's ensure that we have all our health commodities. Africa imports 95% of its health commodities from the rest of the world, 55% from Europe, 15% from the United States. These markets were short. So essentially what we did was, again, Africa came together with African resources to be able to raise resources to buy 30% of the vaccines that it needed. But even though we had the resources to buy the vaccines, we couldn't buy the vaccines because they were nowhere to be found. And so again, there was a problem of transparency, gross inequality. And I think as Professor Stiglitz said, it is a choice. Are we going to stay together for longer in this crisis because we're not leveling the playing field? If one part of the world is not vaccinated, the whole world is not vaccinated. And I think this is the lesson here, that talking about something and actually doing it are very different. And that the concept of Africa as a donor destination or as an aid destination, I think has been turned on its head. And I hope that Africans have understood that if they wait for aid, they clearly are always going to be at the back of the line. They have to take control. They have to decide on their destinies and then come to the table with everybody else. But then the message for the rest of the world is, when Africa comes, can Africa be afforded a level playing field?
Dr. Songwe, again, just to follow up on that, we've heard talks about the debt service suspension initiative that was launched and why many countries rejected it, because there was this threat of downgrade that they received. And you have proposed an alternate solution, or your own solution, rather, not own solution, a solution led by your expertise, called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. I know there have been a few roadblocks for it. So if you could just quickly explain to the people listening what the solution is, what the roadblocks are, and how do we move the needle forward when it comes to the solution proposed by you?
Thank you. And actually, let me just come back on the debt service suspension initiative. Actually, that was also proposed by the Economic Commission for Africa and finance ministers. And it's important to say this. The reason the debt service suspension initiative was proposed was when the crisis began, African finance ministers got together and said, this is not 1980 all over again. This is not Africa's banana republics asking for debt forgiveness altogether. We had our economies that were growing. We had countries growing at 8, 9, 10, 12%. We had an external shock, as Professor Stiglitz would say, when you have an external shock, you cannot then determine how you solve that external shock as if it was an endogenous one. And so essentially what we said was, because we didn't have visibility on the crisis, give us a stay on the payment of our debt service for that year, so we understand what the magnitude of this shock was. This was done across the world. In the United States, people were given 3 months of not paying their mortgages. In Switzerland, for God's sakes, people were given 3 months to not pay for their car notes and other things like that. So that was the beginning, actually, I would say, of Africa taking control and saying, no, we don't just want debt forgiveness and write us off as if we were bad managers of our resources. We were good managers. We need to understand the extent of the crisis. Now, then the other thing that we also did at the same time was call for issuance of special drawing rights. Special drawing rights, I think, are what one could describe as sort of global new printing of money. Everybody gets a free, sort of handout of new resources, a cash injection into everybody's economy. Global economies, they had distributed by quarters, strength and power of everybody's economy. What happened was we got $650 billion of special drawing rights, so new resources, free money, if you want to call it that, injected into the world's economy. Except, unfortunately, Africa only got 5% of all of this new resources that were injected into the global economy. This is, again, part of this dichotomy, because what we saw was the G7 got almost 47% of the $650 billion that was injected, so a lot more than they need. And so the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility is essentially saying three things that we realized during this crisis, or the crisis at least brought to the fore, even more than it has always done. I go back to this level playing field business. When you look at the economies of Egypt and the economy of Portugal or Egypt, or sorry, of Italy or Spain, clearly the Egyptian economy from a macroeconomic fundamentals perspective is doing much better. But when Egypt goes to the markets, the cost of Egypt's borrowing rates are so high. Can you believe in a crisis with the magnitude of this one, you actually have a net transfer from African countries that have access to markets, buying paper much more expensive. So we're transferring resources back into the West, right? And asking for more resources. We're saying level the playing field, bring down the cost for which we offer our paper and ensure that we can do this. But that's the liquidity part. The sustainability part is we've done some work with Oxford University and Professor Nick Stern that shows that essentially growing forward, building forward from this crisis, if we built green, if we developed green, if we did new investments in energy, we will actually be able to create more jobs and add more value. So that's the sustainability part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songwe. Professor Stiglitz, you have spoken about the need for policy reform. I think it's important to address the politics behind economic or policy reform. And there is conversation happening around tax the rich. If you had to explain this in terms of how it affects a family in rural Texas, right? How does it affect a mother who just wants to put food on the table? How would you break it down in terms of why, specifically, what kind of policy reform can we expect and why it's critical at this juncture?
Well, it's actually very simple. Those at the very top pay a smaller fraction of their income in taxes than those down below. And that means our governments don't have enough resources to provide the level playing field, to provide the opportunity. And this is true both within countries and across countries. One of the big problems in the system of multinational taxation is that our very, very smart companies that produce, smartphones and all the other products are also very smart at tax avoidance. And so countries in Africa where production occurs aren't able to collect the fair share of taxes. And this is happening not only in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in America. And so the richest companies in the world are not contributing to addressing the problems, some of the problems that they are creating themselves, the inequality they're contributing to. The drug companies created the opioid crisis, the food companies helped create the childhood diabetes crisis. So they help make these crises. The oil companies and coal companies have made the climate crisis. So they're contributing to making the crisis that the rest of us have to deal with, but then aren't paying their fair share of taxes to enable us to address these crises.
Thank you for your vociferous voice. I want to come back to you, Professor Stiglitz, and the same question to Dr. Songwe as a wrap-up question. Currently, we see countries, especially during the Anga week, we will see heads of states come and make grand declarations about all the great things they've done and all the great things they will do. So putting their feet to the fire, tell us where you think disproportionate time, effort is being spent, which is not having the kind of reward gains that we see, and where they should be looking instead and where they should be putting the money instead. Professor Stiglitz, you first.
So to be very brief, let me just list a few things that they really should be focusing on. The first is the pandemic is still raging. And as just pointed out, there is this vaccine apartheid, a vaccine inequality. It's a supply side problem. They can't get it even if they have the money. And that's why the number one issue is the intellectual property waiver at the WTO. And there just needs to be a commitment, not only to do that, but to do everything else that impedes the production of the supply of vaccines. And if markets can't do it, let's use the War Production Act in the United States to get the vaccines produced. So that's number one. And I was pointing out, none of us are safe until everybody is safe.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. Dr. Songwe, if you want to answer that question or just close us up with what gives you hope during this time of crisis that we're still finding ourselves in?
The next two, and I'm sure he will agree with me so we can take them together, is of course ensuring that more girls have access to school and developing the technology sector for everybody. What gives me hope is exactly that. The innovation that is coming out of this crisis, I think the resilience, as Professor Stiglitz said, that is coming out of this crisis from the emerging world is phenomenal. And so that shows me that I think if we can put our spirits together, we clearly can get there. But before we get there, we must vaccinate and ensure that we all have vaccines and access to vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the both of you, and critically for presenting the numbers in a language to us that we can all understand, and for making an urgent need and case to address inequality. Incredibly grateful for your expertise and call for action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
One of the key takeaways from Professor Stiglitz and Dr. Songwe's conversation for me was that policymakers need to do more to center the expertise of people who have their feet on the ground when drafting solutions. And that's the perfect segue to the next panel, where we have stalwarts from civil society, the premier forces leading the global coordination efforts to fight inequality. Before I introduce them, these conversations will not work without you, the audience members. So please, if you have questions for our panelists, tag SDG16+ on Twitter and ask away. Also share your comments and key takeaways with us. So to the panel, we have Sharon Burrow. She's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, representing 200 million workers in 163 countries and territories with 332 national affiliates. The primary mission is to promote and defend rights of workers and their interests through international cooperation between trade unions, global campaigning, advocacy within major global institutes. Welcome, Sharon. We also have Sanjay Pradhan with us, the CEO of Open Government Partnership. And Sanjay has pretty much dedicated his life to advocating for governments to be more open, participatory, and less corrupt. He's worked extensively on governance and anti-corruption strategy in his current position and also before when he was working at the World Bank. Welcome, Sanjay. We also have Gabrielle Boucher, who's the Executive Director of Oxfam International, a global network which fights inequality to end poverty and injustice. And for Gabriella, this comes from a deep place of personal knowledge and information. She's from Cali, Colombia, and has worked alongside children and communities affected by Colombia's decades-long armed conflict and played a key role in influencing the country's approach on restorative justice for children. Welcome, Gabriella. And we have Dr. Rola Dashti, who's a leading Kuwaiti economist and longtime champion of women's rights, gender equality, and democratic reform. She served as a member of the Supreme Planning Council in Kuwait, and from 2012 to 2014, she was the Minister for Planning and Development and Minister of State for Parliamentary Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Rola. Okay, so we've just heard from the heads of states, and just to take a step back, this entire week we will be hearing from very many heads of states. Sanjay, to you. We've heard from an international efforts perspective of what needs to be done, but as a social activist from India, I always ask myself, how do these commitments from heads of states translate to the lives of citizens on a national and local level, right? So can you share your thoughts on this, centered from a lens of justice and reform? Because we've heard a lot about vaccine apartheid and equity. So I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this.
Thanks, Trisha. So on the two dimensions that you mentioned, so we heard a lot, as you said, on international vaccine equity. I obviously completely agree and echo that. But what I would like to supplement that and strongly endorse an equal call for domestic equity and accountability. Take, for instance, the massive COVID-19 stimulus and safety nets. Governments have launched the biggest stimulus and safety nets since World War II. Millions of lives and livelihoods are at stake. And yet we are seeing a proliferation of corruption scandals. Just think of the gross inequity and injustice in this. The very money that is supposed to help those who have been made more destitute and more vulnerable by the pandemic are being used by the elite and the powerful and the corrupt to enrich themselves further. This obviously has to stop. This is a domestic accountability agenda, and open government approaches can help. For instance, in Colombia, reformers and activists have created a platform through which they are disclosing COVID-19 spending and contracts as open data, and civil society and citizens are monitoring this and reporting violations using a mobile app to ensure that the vulnerable receive this. So this is just one illustration of a broader agenda on domestic justice reform and police reform that we should also address. Just one other point to what you said, which is that we have heard from heads of states here, and we will hear from heads of states in other UN forums this week. It is critical to translate these high-level public pronouncements into concrete country actions. This is particularly important for a panel on inequality. Otherwise, as you say, how will citizens feel the impact of this in their daily lives? Here, the Open Government Partnership, or OGP, is a country-based platform of 78 countries and can help. So for instance, following the London Anti-Corruption Summit, where similarly heads of states made high-level pronouncements, 20 OGP member countries translated those high-level commitments into concrete country actions. And because OGP is a partnership between government and civil society can help advocate translating these high-level political commitments at the UN into country actions, and they can monitor implementation to ensure these translate into tangible benefits in citizens' lives. Back over to you, Trish.
Thank you, Sanjay. So we know that, COVID-19 has made inequality worse, and we have to focus on how we turn things around. So here I want to focus on civil society. Gabriela, to you, if you could tell us specifically the roadblocks that your organization has faced when it comes to enforcing change that other, way smaller actors and players of civil society can know about, and also how you've navigated through these roadblocks.
Thanks very much, Trisha. And I'd like to start by really welcoming the fantastic report that we're launching today. And I prefer to call it a blueprint, and it will be helpful for policymakers around the world, but also to people who are interested in transforming these issues and civil society organizations and movements. So hopefully it's in everybody's desk in New York this week, but also around the world. And as you say, we're here together because we all believe in the importance of addressing extreme inequality, and really every country in the world has a lot to do. And what we need to say is move from rhetoric, and we can agree on the principles, but how about making it real in the territory, and to really, for it to be felt in people's lives. And that's what we want. So it's not abstract ideas, but really to dramatically reduce the gaps between the richest and the poor, and also those gender and racial inequalities that persist. So for me, this is a moment of hope, because we have here a collection of knowledge that is both from academia, but also from the real lives of people and their testimonies that are actually represented in the report. And we've heard, as my predecessor was saying, from governments. So we heard from President Marape of Sierra Leone, and we're hearing also from Prime Minister Ardern of New Zealand. They can demonstrate how another way is possible. And for now, they may be in a minority, but with these paths and the learnings that we have, we can see that there are possibilities, and the market doesn't need to be the ruler, but we can make choices that really put people's rights at the center. So for Oxfam, our role in Pathfinders has been very important over the years, and we really urge leaders to act together to combat inequality. And we really feel that we can better fight inequality within borders if we cooperate across them. So civil society in a particular country can do a lot, but it requires backing and coming together and doing some things at the international level, be it on wealth taxes or strengthening workers' rights. So we believe also at this moment in time, we need real bold action because things are getting extreme. Billionaire wealth has shot up over the last 17 months, more than it had in the past 15 years. So at the same time, hundreds of millions have fallen into poverty. And we know this is intertwined with our climate crisis because the richest 1% are causing double the carbon emissions of the bottom 50%, who in turn also suffer most of all the effects of this changing climate. We've also heard, of course, about the very extreme urgency of vaccine equity, as less than 1% of the 6 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses have gone to low-income countries. So instead of boosting supply and saving lives by breaking pharma monopolies, we see rich country governments defending them. And this is something that needs to change.
Thank you so much.
So I will maybe come back. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. I will definitely come back to you. Sharon, over to you. You know, as a person of color, I often find people that look like me ask for their dignity to be recognized, right? And during this crisis, we had a lot of clapping for workers and essential workers, but yet not a recognition of their rights, of their humanity, of dignity. So could you make a case for what needs to be done in a time-bound manner to center this conversation and dialogue around workers' rights?
Absolutely. And can I say being recognized, but also being valued. There's no doubt that if people are not valued, if their work's not valued, if they don't have the security of knowing that indeed their contribution is part of the solution, then you get the despair and the desperation we're seeing all around the world. And indeed, Gabriela has focused on much of that. But let me say this, in context, we already had massive levels of inequality, historic levels of inequality, and the climate crisis prior to COVID-19. This was already generated in a world that was many times richer, but failed to share its prosperity. COVID-19, as you just said, exposed the fractures in our global economies, in our societies, in people's lives. And for working people, this is represented by a broken labour market. Not just failing to share income distribution, because labour income share has been a roller coaster going downwards since the 80s, and the explosion of globalisation with those exploitative supply chains and the blockages to development for poorer countries and regions. But it's also exposed the fact that you just indicated, that people are excluded, that even when our society depends on those essential workers, they're not indeed recognised or valued. They're often obscured in our daily lives, and yet we are indeed very dependent on them to survive. So I think for me, I'd say two things. One is that Pathfinders, their new report highlights, of course, the negative impacts on economic growth, on social cohesion, and in public trust in institutions, which I've just touched on for workers. But you know what? We know the solutions. If you look at the SDGs and the promise of a world that actually dealt with poverty, that dealt with insecurity, it actually deals with some of those questions of equality, Goal 5. It deals with access to health, Goal 3, universal education, Goal 4, and of course the dignity of full employment and decent work, Goal 8, which is at the centre of our demand for a new social contract. But look at Goal 10. It says governments must do what Jacinda Ardern and others are doing, all women, all headed by women, these governments, who are actually broadening their accountability for distributing their wealth to people in a more equal and a more open way. And if you look at what we're saying about a new social contract, then goal 10 with all the other goals, but particularly those goals I mentioned, is absolutely about saying full employment, jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs at the heart of security. It's about the dignity of rights. And that means collective bargaining, the freedom to organise, but it also means that we need to look at equality of income, gender and race. And that will bring with it minimum living wages and our third demand, which is indeed universal social protection. If you don't have jobs, rights, and indeed universal social protection, and most of the world don't, so we have no resilience to global or personal shocks, then you can't have equality, you can't have the recognition you so rightfully point out, and you certainly can't have an inclusive future we all stand for. So we do know the solutions. The question is the political will there to work with organisations like unions, like NGOs, and really put these policies in place?
Thank you, Sharon. I always love to say that politicians and political will are renewable resources. The climate isn't. The Pathfinders report talks about the need for action. Specifically, I want to highlight one action point, which is secure credibility by tackling corruption and build trust in government and institutions. Dr. Rola, as someone who's played a pivotal role in advocating for a decree to allow Kuwaiti women to run and vote to vote and run for parliamentary elections, you know what it takes to get things done. So can you outline a specific policy and what we need to do to get it in play?
Thank you very much. But let me first second Gabriel and others on this groundbreaking policy document. It is a blueprint actually, and it is a policy oriented, solution oriented. I'm not going to get into various solutions that we advocate into it, but gives direction. And I think what needs to be done is a collective will. Not only it's a government will, but it's a collective will to push things forward on issues of equality, in issues of opportunities. Today, we leave things unto the politicians to take actions, but priorities of politicians are different than priorities of individual people collectively. There is different power struggle in this. And I think it's about time that we bring also a main stakeholder, which is the elites and the wealthiest, the top 10 percentile in our economy, to be part of the solution. Okay, not only as paying taxes, but to be part of the solution of creating opportunities to the lower end of the scale, to create opportunities for the poor, to create opportunities for the youth, not leaving it only to the state. It's a will for all of us. We need to do more, but collectively more. And I think it is about time to say it's a shared responsibility. What we are facing now in inequality exclusion is a responsibility for all of us to move forward and work more to reach a sustainable and achieve the SDG goals, the equality, the poverty reduction, and creating an opportunity that is everybody will be benefiting. Now we're looking into a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win game if we collectively move forward as we go along.
Thank you, Dr. Rola. Gabrielle, I want to come to you. You know, we've heard a lot about how billionaires' tax have doubled, quadrupled. We clearly cannot appeal to their decency or morality. So we know the problem. May I ask you, what is Oxfam doing to address this? That will actually, that perhaps if you want to frame it within the construct of how does it affect specifically the Global South? So what is Oxfam doing in terms of actual policies or action points to address this problem of grave inequality right now?
Thank you. I think what we're all doing is working increasingly in partnership. And this is what I also hear all the panelists saying and what the report says. It's not something Oxfam as an organization can do alone, or a government can do alone, or a group of a certain sector of society. And in the case of billionaires, there's of course a variety, and there's some billionaires actually who are stating their interest in contributing to society and speaking about the importance of them paying taxes, because taxes are the ways in which you really fund public services that are absolutely transformative for equality. So we know nothing replaces civil investments in education or investments in health or social protection, and the importance of also investing in the care economy, which is also highlighted in the report. And that is the way in which we bring gender justice at the core of a new social contract, which is very much also the way we see this transformative action. So I think it's seeing it as an equation. So seeing visible actions that really impact people's lives, in particularly women's rights and people who have been marginalized. And you can see that in many different contexts, in many different countries, there's a similar diagnosis. People are worried about the fractures of society. So there's that common, that's a very good starting point, that we see the same problem. And then here we have solutions that have worked, that need to be adapted to contexts, and that definitely work in connection with movements and people power. So nothing will be achieved if it's not in conjunction and in alliance with movements and workers, people who are working on different issues coming together. So we need to invest our efforts in supporting them and protecting their space to come together and disrupt in a creative, positive way. So people power, solidarity is what can truly shift the dial of society. And it has been the only thing that has ever achieved it. And if we come together with focused approaches such as the ones we can see today, I'm sure we can achieve.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gabriela. Sanjay, I want to come to you. I would like to push you a little bit on if you could tell me a specific policy that Open Government Partnership is working on, or there is, and I just want to push you to frame it in a way that, you know, to a person sitting, to a family sitting and watching this, they can understand the relevance and importance of this policy, and then they can then pick up their phones, tweet to their relevant elected leaders and say, hey, the policy is here, get going and, you know, make sure it affects our lives. So could you do that for us, please?
Sure. So actually, there are three examples of policies. First is the Roma minority in North Macedonia. If you're the Roma minority, you have not had property rights, you've suffered from exclusion for a long period of time. Courageous reformers and activists in North Macedonia have enhanced access to justice, legal services and so on for the Roma minority in North Macedonia, leveraging the OGP action plan. They have similarly done so for those living below the poverty line, providing them paralegal services and so on in Indonesia. So these are concrete examples which are touching the lives of those who have been historically marginalized and excluded. And this is the first pillar of the report, which is to provide visible gains to those who are marginalized at the bottom of society. The second part, which will appeal to those who are listening, is that you distrust that power is being exercised to benefit those elite and corrupt at the top. And one of the things that courageous reformers and activists are doing is to hold them to account. So I take you to Ukraine, where the public procurement process was captured by oligarchs. And after the Maidan Revolution, young reformers and activists leveraged the OGP platform to disclose all public procurement contracts, which were shrouded in secrecy, in open data format, and citizens can monitor and report violations. In 2 years, citizens reported 14,000 violations, government saved $1 billion, and there were 82% of the private sector reported reduced corruption. So that's the second area which the report talks about, which is combating grand corruption to build credibility. And the third and final area is that we have a polarized world. Politicians are polarizing us. And one of the things that courageous reformers and activists are doing in OGP is they're doing deliberative societal dialogues. In Scotland, exactly to the point of this panel, 100 citizens were brought together in a citizen assembly on solutions to tackle inequality in the nation. And it actually furthered understanding amongst the people, and it built common solutions that they didn't think was existing. We need these three types of approaches that I've said: enhance access to justice, combat corruption, build societal dialogues. But the last thing I would say is these are too few and far between. We need to scale this up to tackle the challenge of inequality.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Sharon, during this whole week, we will see heads of states stand on the podium and make declarations. Just picking up on power to the people that Gabriela said, if you had the most marginalized, vulnerable forces within the workers' union be able to change roles and instead occupy those podiums, what do you think they would be advocating for? What is it that the people need to be listening to when it comes to their issues?
Wouldn't that be something? Can you just imagine that if you actually had a lineup of people that we nominated to stand on those platforms, Gabriela? It would be an enormous pleasure to do so. But look, they would tell you they want what everybody in the world wants. They want access for themselves to healthcare. They want access for their children to education. They want the burden of care lifted off women with investment in the resilience of care. And that requires the kind of taxation justice. We've created more billionaires through this pandemic, while we've also created, millions more thrown into poverty, and it just doesn't equate. If we're not prepared to share our wealth, if we're not prepared to invest in jobs, what families need is jobs, decent jobs with wages they can live on, with the power to actually negotiate with their employers because they have rights, but they also need to know that when they're in trouble, there is a resilient base of universal social protection. So let me challenge those heads of state on just one humanitarian thing they could do this week. They could actually commit to a global fund for social protection. You have 72% of the world's people with little or no social protection, 55% with none. Why is it then we know the economic statistics, you get a higher return on investment in social protection and you get a basic economy with jobs. But nevertheless, this investment doesn't flow. If we genuinely care about solidarity, let's fund the poorest countries to build social protection systems.
Thank you, Sharon, so much for that strong call to action. Dr. Rola, as someone who's been a lifelong advocate for women's rights, real quick, because we're super short on time, could you help make a case on women's economic justice during this critical time, what we need to be specifically focusing on? You on mute.
Sorry. Most of our women who are working are mostly in the informal sector. These women needs to have social protection, needs to have an expansion of social safety net. So we need to bring the informality to formality. If we don't bring them, we need to ensure that whoever is in the informal sector are protected, have the protection in social safety net. Sharon, Gabriel, and Sanjay was talking about, it is creating not only access, but creating also opportunity for decent life. You can't keep not giving the opportunity for decent life. And this is what women needs, and not only women, the youth and all our citizens need on the issue of opportunity, accessibility, opportunity, and protection, so that can move forward. And engagement partnership, we're talking about social funds, social solidarity fund is extremely important globally or country national, at national level or at a regional level. We think also is the importance issue. We don't need, I don't think the rhetoric is that we want to penalize the people who were successful and making money. We were trying to say is you're not because of you're asking you to pay just taxes. We're trying to say it is a shared responsibility. It's by being successful, you know how to create opportunity. Join your society and link, cooperate and partner with the lower class to be a shared responsibility to uplift the society forward. And the last minute I will say, and I will tell you,
if I could just ask you a quick, the last question. If you had a call for accountability, call to lean in for the heads of states watching this, or alternatively, a call for action to the people watching this, what would it be?
Bring the people in the informal sector, have a social protection for the vulnerable groups.
Thank you so very much. Gabriella, same question. Call for accountability, call to lean in, call to action, either to the government watching this or to the people.
To come together as many countries did after the Second World War. So we're in a similar moment of reaching bottom, and we need some hope for the future so we can bring that solidarity, that building of welfare states, corporate taxes, wealth taxes that came after that time, and they were kept on for years because there was backing for those policies. So we're in a similar stage where we can bounce back in solidarity, and there are plenty of policies here to see how we can do it.
Thank you so much. Sanjay, to you. You're on mute.
I would call on all government reformers and civil society activists listening to this to leverage the record 100 OGP national action plans and local action plans that are being co-created, leverage them to advance concrete reforms like access to justice, like opening contracts, like deliberative dialogues. So we turn this crisis of inequality, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic, into an opportunity to build back better.
Thank you. And Sharon, over to you.
I'm going to agree with all three of these amazing people. End corruption, put in place taxation that is a contribution back to society from the wealthy, and indeed make sure that we formalise work everywhere. 2 billion people in informal work, 60% of the workforce, and the majority of women. Formalise work and provide just wages, secure work, and that universal social protection to give people hope in terms of national, personal, or global shocks.
Thank you so much. And speaking of hope, we will now be moving on to Chef Jose Andres. He is world-renowned for his Michelin star restaurants and culinary prowesses, but he chose to channel all of that brilliance to bring his kitchen and food to communities reeling from disasters. He founded World Central Kitchen, a non-profit devoted to providing meals in the wake of natural disasters, with the goal to make a lasting impact through food. So over to you, Chef Andres.
An important lesson that I've learned is how food and empathy must go hand in hand. It was the reason I founded my NGO, World Central Kitchen, in 2010, after the earthquake in Haiti. I realized that chefs like me, we feed the few when we have the skills to actually feed the many. A plate of food in difficult times sends a message that we care. We're here for one another, and that tomorrow things may be a little bit better. And when that plate of food can be made and served by members of our community with familiar recipes and ingredients we purchase locally, we not only put the economy up and running on the road to recovery, we also help to build communities that are more inclusive, more equitable, and more resilient to the future challenges we may face. We know that the climate crisis has a disproportionate impact on those who face food insecurity, and that with each new hurricane, flood, and wildfire, our food system becomes more fragile. More people are forced to migrate in search of food and a better life for their children. But if we put food at the center of our solutions, if we put our boots on the ground and lift up the people around us, and we call on our governments and our institutions to do the same, I do believe that we can look at the future with hope. So I ask you all to join me, and together we will build longer tables where there is a seat for everyone. Are you with me?
Hello again, welcome back. The problem of inequality and exclusion is not just an academic issue. We can see the consequences of it every day. Celebrities and public champions, young and old, all over the globe, have sent us some inspiring words and thoughts.
The COVID-19 pandemic has defined our times, not just because of the virus itself, but the ways in which it has revealed and aggravated our society's inequalities. Some of these inequalities deal with health, as we've seen disparities between who has access to services and vaccines and who doesn't. This is true both among countries and within individual nations. Across the globe, we've seen how the poorest and most vulnerable populations were the most impacted. We witnessed how many of the least developed countries struggled to manage the pandemic. But the crisis isn't just sanitary. The economic impact of the virus has been disproportionately unequal. Millions of ordinary people lost their jobs, while billionaires had the biggest increase in wealth ever. We also can't ignore the psychological aftermath of the pandemic, especially for young people whose educational, social, and cultural lives have been uprooted. This is a group that probably paid the highest social economic price of the pandemic, even though youth were the least exposed to its health concerns. These inequalities tell us that our problem isn't just one for the present. We will continue to have a problem in the future if we don't address the inequalities that COVID-19 has precipitated. They hamper our collective capacity for resilience and innovation. The sustainability of our societies is at stake.
In country after country, public outrage has been provoked by deliberate policy choices made by governments. Such choices that have generated upheaval when seen as deliberately benefiting a small group of elite while blatantly ignoring or undermining the rights and needs of populations who already live in a state of deprivation and despair. We need leaders to deepen solidarity across societies by actively fighting systemic prejudice and discrimination. People of all ages and affiliations should have the means and resources to actively understand, influence, and engage with public policies. We need to foster dialogue and initiative across all sections of society and demonstrate an inclusive approach to leadership that celebrates a creative and collaborative engagement with diversity and dissent. Every country must put in place the infrastructure and investment needed for a strong, networked, and fully empowered civil society. We must have stronger national and international laws that protect civil society and civic freedoms, and a fully resourced mechanism for democracy to ensure the effective implementation of these laws. The protection of civic space cannot be an afterthought. Civil society must have the resources it needs to fulfill its crucial role in securing accountability and ensuring that no one is left behind.
It is only by fixing inequality and exclusion in the world that we can build forward better from ongoing global challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic. And we cannot tackle inequality without meaningful and diverse youth engagement at all levels of decision making, affecting people, planet, and prosperity. With that in mind, last year, heads of state requested that the UN Secretary General to report back with recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. Following extensive consultations with governments, thought leaders, civil society, young people, and the UN, the report was launched a few days ago. Our common agenda is an agenda of action designed to strengthen and accelerate multilateral agreements, particularly the 2030 Agenda, and make a tangible difference in people's lives. It is rooted in the knowledge that we are at an inflection point in history, and our action or inaction today will determine whether we break down or break through these crises. Young people know this, and they have been raising their voices, employing their most innovative solutions, holding leaders accountable, and activating their peers to drive the transformational change we need to build a better world for all. With our common agenda, we have a unique opportunity to break through together, reimagine what meaningful youth engagement looks like, remove obstacles that stand in the way of young people achieving their full potential and realizing their fundamental human rights, and closing the gap to achieve equality and inclusion. I urge world leaders to work with youth in all their diversity, especially those who are coming from communities and social groups poorly represented in the national and global governance systems, to be a central part of the rebuilding process. And I stand ready to work with all of you to deepen our solidarity with the world's young people and future generations.
Courageous government reformers and civil society activists across our 78-country Open Government Partnership are bridging the divide by empowering marginalized groups at the bottom of society and reining in the abusers of power at the top. For instance, they're enhancing access to justice for the historically marginalized Roma community in North Macedonia, or those living below the poverty line in Indonesia, and they're combating corruption and capture at the top, for instance through open contracting in Ukraine or open company ownership in Nigeria. These reforms are encouraging, but still too few to tackle the massive challenge of inequality. Let us join forces to scale these up.
Now is the time to start our process of healing, not only from the pandemic, but also from decades of division and discrimination. Everyone has a stake in this endeavor, especially young people who are our change makers for today and tomorrow. Progress is within reach if world leaders from all countries and regions rally to empower their youth, especially those that belong to the vulnerable groups and conflict-affected communities, to be a central part of a global movement for inclusion and solidarity.
Thank you for staying with us. It's time now for our final panel discussion of the event, where we'll be looking at the partnerships that are needed to truly make a difference. We have with us the President of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, the Prime Minister of Sweden, Stefan Löfven, and Alicia Bárcena of the UN Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean, and Sanda Ojiambo, who's CEO of the UN Global Compact, which is a voluntary initiative based on CEO commitments to implement universal sustainability principles and to take steps to support UN goals. Thank you all very much for joining us here in person. As the pandemic continues with so many struggling around the world, there are growing calls for a renewed social contract, including by the UN Secretary General in his UN Common Agenda. If we could start with you, please, President Alvarado. Costa Rica has been a model of peaceful dialogue and good governance in the region. What does the social contract mean to Costa Rica, and how has inequality and the lack of resources frayed that social contract?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really proud to be with you all today. That social contract in principle means that everybody should be allowed to have certain opportunities. We're talking about quality education for everybody. We're talking about opportunities in terms of healthcare and access to healthcare. Currently, in today's world, we're talking about access to the digital means of communication and all related to the labor market, but also to education and for a better life and to connect. The thing is that inequality, it's you can see the gap in the access of many of those. Not the same quality of education, not the same quality of healthcare throughout the societies or within a country, not the same access to technology, or even not the same rights for populations. Let's talk about women, let's talk about the rights of children, of migrants, and other populations. So That's a scenario that was there even before the pandemic, and the social contract tries to eliminate or diminish those inequalities. But the pandemic has triggered more inequalities, and for governments, it's been tough to handle this. We have a decrease in our economies. We have expansion in our expenditure. That means we need to address buying vaccines, increasing our budgets. And at the same time, our countries, particularly mid-income countries, were already indebted. So the fiscal margins to attend many of these inequalities have dramatically reduced. And that's one of the key problems that we need to tackle through international cooperation.
We're going to look at that a little later on. Alicia, as far as a new social contract goes, what are the lessons from the Latin American and Caribbean region, which is seen as the most unequal region in the world?
Well, first of all, I have to say that we are living in a world of profound asymmetries. And I think this is creating a lot of disenchantment and frustration in society. So we are living in gaps where we have an elite that is the winner of everything, and then we have another part of society which is the loser of everything. So these inequalities, are creating so much mistrust. Society doesn't trust institutions, either public or private. So everybody's looking for something, and that something is that the capitalistic system, is not working for all, simply. And that's the problem. It's generating concentration of income, of wealth, of power, of access, of everything. So unless we understand what's happening to people and what's happening to the world, I'm sorry to say, we are living in a multilateralism that is not working, a deficit of solidarity today that is even making these asymmetries more deep and more complicated, I must say. So unless we really change the development paradigm and the way we are communicating with people, and how do we bring them on board, but really, because we talk about consulting the indigenous peoples and this and that and the other, but it's not about that. It's about really building a very different system of power. We have to change the power system. My view.
On that note, Prime Minister Löfven, Sweden has a social contract concept called Folkhemmet. It's a literal translation as people's home. Maybe a better way of describing it is national family, where people belong together with a mutual sense of obligation. What challenges has Folkhemmet faced, and what's being done to address those challenges?
Well, first, Folkhemmet was established by an early prime minister of Sweden in the late 1920s, early 1930s, because he wanted to describe a society as a family. The whole society, the whole country, we need to include everybody, and you treat one another as a family. And then people could also see, while the government at the time, from the early 1930s and decades forward, took initiatives, new legislation, allocated resources, social security, education, health care, and all this, people could see and follow the development. Yes, this is a Folkhemmet, this is people's, this is our family now. So it made sense. And the challenges now is, of course, that we also face increased inequality due to the pandemic. So that's for sure. But what we're trying to do during the pandemic is to ease the burden for individuals, so that we improved the unemployment benefits during the pandemic, because we saw that, of course, people will become unemployed. But added to that, we supported our enterprises and our public services with a huge amount of money to make sure that less people will get unemployed. So we saw the challenge, but we took it on and tried to do the best. But I'm not saying that we are also hurt by this pandemic, and we also have an increased inequality. But I must say that I fully agree with you. We need to have a new multilateral system that also that we can make the world as a family. That's a narrative that we should build on.
Sandra, what private sector action is needed to support a new social contract?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, for private sector, it's got to be an acknowledgement that actually private sector should be part of the social contract. For the longest time, I think the sentiment has been that governments lead on addressing all of the social issues, and governments and perhaps civil society. There is an increased awareness of the role that private sector should play in societal transformation. It's not always been the case. So I think first acknowledgement is one of the biggest issues. Actually, in the SG's Common Agenda report, he talked about this being either the moment for a breakdown or a breakthrough. Now, those are words that will resonate with business, because no business is looking for a breakdown in the social environment. Business will never thrive when society around it is failing. So I think first of all is the acknowledgement. Second, and it's been mentioned here, is trust. Businesses need to be trusted. Recent studies by some research firms have indicated that business is increasingly being a trusted institution globally. I think this year the Edelman Trust report ranked business as the highest trusted institution, but that's got to continue over time. We've got to trust business, and business has to come to the table as part of the social contract. I think the third piece for me really is a full engagement in terms of responsible business, sustainable business practices, and really understanding that business must be involved in societal transformation. It's at the core of a lot of the work that we do at the Global Compact, but I think most importantly, it's got to be at the core of the work that business does globally. So acknowledgement, understanding that business has to be part of societal transformation, and building trust.
The Pathfinders report that we've been talking about, From Rhetoric to Action, has a really strong message that international action or cooperation needs to support national action to stop rising inequality. President Alvarado, as the COVID pandemic continues, there are growing concerns that poorer populations are going to lose out on access to solutions, to products, technologies to fight COVID. Costa Rica has actually asked the World Health Organization to create a voluntary pool for patent rights, vaccine information, and any other information to help combat the pandemic. You're also pushing for more financing to help with recovery from this crisis. What kind of progress have you seen on that? Has anything happened?
Well, on the case of FACE, which is the proposal of the fund to alleviate COVID economics, we have worked together with ICLAC, with Alicia, to raise some proposals on how that's going to work. But for this to happen, we need the G20 and the strongest economies to help other economies in the world, actually under the concept that Stefan just mentioned. If we are a family as a whole in the planet, in order for all of us to be okay, we need to have that solidarity. And we are not going to be as good as the most vulnerable in the planet. That's why we need that solidarity. So we're working on FACE with Alicia in the Latin America and with other partners, talking to the G20 to make them aware of the situation. I mean, it's not only COVID, it's climate change. It's many things going on at the same time. In the Latin American region, in the Caribbean, hurricanes, for example, when a hurricane hits, then you need more cash to reconstruct, to rebuild. For example, when Stefan was mentioning the programs of Sweden, that is true solidarity. But not all of the mid-income countries had the margins to expand their social networks to protect people like that. So people will end up suffering. And in the case of CITAP, this is the other initiative, we are inviting people to voluntarily put their technologies so there can be a cheaper access to those. And there's kind of a struggle because of the patents and the intellectual property. But it's true that we need more access in order to reduce the gap in health as well.
Prime Minister Lövin, we've been hearing about the need for money, funding. What more do you think can be done to help reboot the world financially and ensure a more equitable recovery, if that's possible?
We need to have a common view on that every individual has a right to develop, and we must do our own part in our own country, and we do that, but we need to cooperate much more internationally. And I think the Global Compact job is an important one. I think inclusion is key. Inclusion, and that is why I also initiated the Global Deal concept, because I think it's crucial that people feel that they are a part of the process, a part of what's happening, a part of the future, meaning jobs, of course, and we have a lot of possibilities around the world with all the wealth that is built into the world, but so unequal distributed. But I think it takes, at the end of the day, a new multilateral agenda, and I fully support the Secretary General's vision. And we need to work through something that shows that every region in the world, every country has a possibility to. Let me give an example. When we tried to develop we supported the development of vaccines. And then they started to produce vaccines and send it to separate countries. And I remember I was so annoyed that we didn't have a global perspective. So EU, we were producing, and we actually exported. So every other dose that was produced in EU is exported. But otherwise, a regional country here, a regional country there, and a lot of countries without vaccines. Instead of sitting down together, saying this is the global need, so many doses, how do we increase our production, what do we do with the logistics, and how do we make sure that everybody gets it? Because nobody's safe until everybody's safe.
You mentioned here, we're talking about unequal vaccine distribution. You also talked about unequal wealth distribution. Sander, 132 countries recently agreed to a new international minimum corporate tax. Many polls have showed that many people are angry. You're talking about trust, and they think the rich and private corporations are not doing enough. They're not paying enough taxes. What more do you think private corporations can do and should do to contribute to social welfare?
Right, and it's, I mean, as you mentioned, there is the movement around the minimum 15% tax and just making sure that multinationals also pay tax where they sell their products and services. I think it's estimated that that would free up about close to between, I think, 100 billion to 240 billion of funding. And the truth is, you know, contextualizing it in the current pandemic, I think a lot of developing countries have to shift resources away from financing for development issues to really address the pandemic, which I think post-pandemic leaves a lot of countries much worse. I come from Kenya, which is, you know, classic example where the pandemic really hit from an economic front before it did from a health front. You know, lots of negative impact on the SME economy, on jobs and on livelihoods. But so that notwithstanding, you know, the question being, what more can private sector do? I do think, first of all, it's got to be a partnership. This is private sector working hand in hand with the public sector. But a couple of things, I think, you know, looking more at partnerships that help create additional revenue streams, looking more at shifting, you know, financing for development, moving less from philanthropic funding for development issues, driving more impact-based investing in development, I think is really important. We are mobilizing within the Global Compact, for example, a task force of CFOs to really look at how they can shift funding within the private sector, really to address sustainable development issues. So I think there's a lot of opportunity around how the private sector looks at its engagement in sustainable development, and certainly the SDGs are a great North Star to look at as a whole. So taxation for sure is one issue, but certainly I think financing for development from a private sector angle will obviously make a big difference.
Alicia, President Alvarado actually has been warning that there could be unrest in the developing world without more COVID aid from richer nations and the IMF, as rising debt risks more inequality and instability. Do you share President Alvarado's concerns?
Absolutely. I mean, let me tell you the first thing. There is excess of liquidity in the developed world. So what we are talking about here is the reallocation, redistribution of liquidity. Otherwise, the world is going to enter in a big trouble. Why? because now the G20 is not helping the middle income countries. No, they're only helping the low income countries. But 95% of debt in the world is in the hands of middle income countries. If we fail, the world fails. So we need definitely a debt relief agreement, accord, for small economies, for small island development states, that debt relief should become, I would say, resilience funds. For example, we are fighting for a Caribbean resilience fund with the Latin American and Caribbean countries. If we don't get that, can you imagine what's happening today? We have economies that are paying 70% of their revenues they get from exports or whatever to pay the debt service. Come on. We're talking about Jamaica, Barbados, etc., countries that are highly vulnerable. So the world, we need a new multilateral pact on financing for development with a debt component, with the liquidity reallocation. phase is a form of liquidity reallocation. And we also need, I believe so, we need innovative instruments. For example, hurricane clauses in the debt negotiations. Because if a country is hit by a hurricane, they don't have capability to pay that debt. So they should be given. So there are a lot of things that we should rethink. And the other thing, sorry that I'm being so provocative, is that we need a new credit, we need a credit agency, the ones that are, ¿cómo se dice? Las agencias calificadoras. The credit
rating?
Rating
system,
yes,
credit rating.
that are, they are punishing our countries all over during the pandemics, because there are three, by the way, only three, 1, 2, 3. And we need a credit rating agency that is multilateral, that has the criteria, no question about it. We need macroeconomic criteria, but we also need other criteria in this credit rating.
A big global system is
multilateral reform
needed,
on financing for development.
Now, as inequalities are rising around the world, the climate crisis is also getting worse. We've got COP26, which is the UN Climate Change Conference. That's going to be held in November. President Alvarado, Costa Rica is the first tropical country to reverse deforestation successfully. How are efforts to continue to do so and to fight climate change affected by rising inequality?
Well, we can say there is, as has been said, a pressure on how we can address that. But at the same time, we need to do it. It's one, if not the most pressing issue, because the survival of humanity literally depends on us now addressing climate change. It's as simple as that. So our approach is that we have launched, for example, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. This is protecting 30% of land and 30% of the ocean by 2030. And this will give a chance to nature-based solutions to contribute and stabilize the situation on climate and to achieve the 1.5 centigrades goal. Many people will say, but yeah, that's expensive and that's not good for profit. Our example in Costa Rica, that reforestation, actually building national parks, payment for environmental services, and others have become very profitable. Our ecotourism, which represents 8% of our GDP, is based actually on ecotourism, based in large part on forests, mountains, beaches, biodiversity, people that do bird watching, surf, and many other industries. So we need to understand this shift and see that it's not only the ethical thing to do, but it's also a profitable thing to do. Exactly. So that's the way we need to go.
Prime Minister Lövin, how do you see inequality and climate change as linked, given Sweden's ambition to become the world's first fossil-free welfare state?
Well, it is linked because we need everybody to be able to go the right direction. But we have different possibilities, different circumstances. You have that within the country, because I mean this is similar case to the pandemic. We say when it comes to the pandemic, but that nobody's safe until everybody's safe. It's a similar situation with the climate. Nobody is safe until we actually can handle the whole globe and make the right thing. And if it's a difference within the country, people have different possibilities to adapt to a new economy, then we have to support them to that. But it's also important for us as a wealthy nation to see that a less wealthier nation needs support from us. And that is why we are, if not the biggest, one of the biggest donors to the Green Climate Fund, because we see the necessity of making it possible for others as well. And then you have the inequality that we need to address.
Last question to you, Alicia, because we are running out of time. Again, there are a lot of competing demands for funds, climate change, inequality, poverty. Is the climate crisis, is it climate crisis versus inequality? Is one more important than the other, or do they both have to be tackled together?
Of course, they have to be tackled together. And not only that, it's a problem of sequence. First of all, vaccines. Second, we have to focus on inequality, of course, that is related to income and wealth and so forth. But a basic inequality in terms of climate change is that we have a lot of countries that are emitting much less than others, but that are being very much affected. So we have to look into adaptation and mitigation. Now, mitigation is receiving much more attention than adaptation. And we need funds. We need funding mechanisms to cope with adaptation, to cope with resilience, to build resilience. And as Prime Minister just said, nobody's safe until everybody's safe. We cannot create islands of immunity or islands of resilience. And what about the rest? I mean, climate change is a global problem. Inequality still has not been understood as a global problem, but it is a global problem. And so that's where they are so much linked. And this is where we in ECLAC talk about the culture of privileges, because we need definitely to stop with that. Naturalizing inequalities or discrimination is not the way forward.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I really wish we could continue talking, but I'm afraid we have run out of time for this panel discussion. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and ideas, and I hope that this can lead to more multinational, multilateral cooperation and, lasting change. Thank you very much once again. Up next, we have a statement from the UN Secretary General delivered by Winnie Byanyima, who's Executive Director of UNAIDS. After that, we'll have some thoughts from world leaders who were not able to join us today because of COVID and travel restrictions. And after that, Sarah will be back with some key takeaways from today's event.
I bring you greetings from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. He regrets not being able to be with us here today. I'm pleased to share with you his message at this event on delivering the United Nations Common Agenda, Action to Achieve Equality and Inclusion. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated beyond doubt that our current systems and frameworks are not fit for purpose and need upgrading. My report on our common agenda, presented to the General Assembly 2 weeks ago, sets out my recommendations to strengthen and reinvigorate multilateralism and to make it more inclusive, networked, and effective in response to the pandemic and the many other global challenges we face. Inequality, exclusion, and mistrust are a growing blight both within and between societies, affecting billions of people around the world. My report proposes a series of measures to tackle inequality and rebuild trust and social cohesion, based on a deepening of unity and solidarity and the protection of human rights. We need a renewed social contract, including universal health coverage and income protection, housing and decent work, quality education, and an end to discrimination and violence against women and girls. And we need greater solidarity at the global level to end the pandemic, tackle the climate emergency, and bring an end to poverty and hunger. The recommendations set out in our common agenda emerged over a year of consultations with member states, with civil society, thought leaders, young people, and others. I hope these constituencies will now take up my proposals, champion them, and find concrete and practical ways to implement them. The members of the Leaders Network Reinforcing Multilateralism Together and the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies represent some of the most important of these constituencies. Today's event is an example of the multi-stakeholder engagement that will be needed to promote and develop the ideas in our common agenda. I send my warmest wishes to all those participating and look to you to continue to drive change with energy, unity, and vision.
I am delighted as President of Ireland to join my fellow heads of state and other leaders today in our shared and urgent call for such action as might give authenticity to our many statements of the past in which we expressed our wish to achieve a more equal world. 6 years ago this week, all United Nations member states came together and committed to an ambitious and historic agenda of change, Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals. On that day, our words pledged that no one would be left behind, that all nations and peoples, all segments of society, would share in the achievement of these goals. We did so on the principle that the dignity of every human being is fundamental. Today, inequality, exclusion, hunger, and poverty have all deepened as affronts to that dignity we recognized. Such events as are now unfolding are causing our words, our commitments into question, in such a way as undermines multilateralism itself. We must recommit again with meaning and purpose to our shared goals and the principles on which they are based. Ireland has placed equality and inclusion at the heart of our global engagement. Our climate action emphasises climate justice, and our international development policy is built around a vision to reach those in greatest need. Human rights, achieving and vindicating them, we believe must underpin the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and continue to guide everything we do. Systemic change will only come about through collaboration. We must work together. That is why multilateralism is the bedrock of our foreign policy. It is at the heart of who we are as a nation. I firmly believe that we can make new history. By doing these tasks together, we can achieve equality and inclusion. For the sake of all people, for the planet, and our shared fulfillment, we must succeed. Words into acts. Let that be our guide.
Ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to the Leaders Network, to Pathfinders, the Centre for International Cooperation, and the governments of Spain and Sweden for the opportunity to contribute to this important event on delivering the UN Common Agenda. 3 years ago, I made my first speech to the UN General Assembly about the value and importance of kindness. 2 years ago, here in New Zealand, we introduced something that we've called the wellbeing approach into, for instance, our budgets. This year, the world has changed immeasurably due to COVID-19 pandemic, and we are both more connected, yet further apart than ever before. Exclusion and inequality progress as the pandemic does, and those concepts of kindness and well-being are just as important, perhaps even more so. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have always tried to look out for each other with compassion and empathy. Kindness has been the central tenet of our COVID response. Yet we've not escaped the fact that some in our communities have been more impacted than others. Crises such as COVID highlight the inequalities that already exist. This is true at home in New Zealand and internationally. We know that women bear a disproportionate burden, as do other people already at risk of being left behind. This includes children and young people, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, our rainbow communities. In New Zealand, we will continue to prioritise increasing inclusion and equality for all our people, while we mitigate the risk that COVID further exacerbates those existing inequalities, including those experienced by Māori and Pacific peoples. COVID-19 has also intensified and further complicated existing global challenges, including progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. For Pacific Island countries, the pandemic has heightened economic and social development challenges and compounded the threat of climate change and what it poses to livelihoods, security and well-being. In order to reach common goals, we need more collaboration and more examples of the international community prioritising our collective and global well-being over domestic self-interest. International work to ensure equitable access to safe and effective vaccines is an example of this, although much more work remains to be done. New Zealand will continue to support this effort through our funding to the COVAX facility and our work with Australia and others to support full vaccine coverage for Pacific Island countries. We cannot strive for stability without also striving for equality. We cannot strive for peace without rejecting hatred and exclusion. And we cannot strive for progress without ensuring development is sustainable, inclusive and values-driven. To achieve all this means accelerating action to achieve human rights, gender equality, the empowerment of all women and girls, and the sound stewardship of the environment. We need to leave no one behind as we build forward better. The pandemic has changed the magnitude and the urgency of our challenge, but our shared commitment to eliminating inequality and exclusion remains firm. Working with kindness to ensure well-being for all, we can achieve our goals together. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to you all. I thank the Presidents of Costa Rica, Sierra Leone, Spain, and the Prime Minister of Sweden for inviting me to this high-level event. I appreciate its focus on the UN Common Agenda to achieve equality and inclusion. The Secretary General's report on our common agenda provides an alarming picture of the growing inequality across the world. COVID-19 pandemic has hit the poorest and the most vulnerable countries the hardest. Our decades of development gains on reducing poverty, inequality, and exclusion are rapidly sliding back. Ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of Bangladesh guarantees equality of opportunity to all citizens. Our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, in his maiden speech at the UNGA in 1974 said, I quote, "There is an international responsibility to ensuring everyone the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family," unquote. This vision is more relevant now than ever before. In keeping with this very spirit, we have adopted a whole society approach in realizing the SDGs and ensuring a COVID recovery that will leave no one behind. We have placed the most vulnerable section of our society at the center of our efforts, and that include women, the ultra-poor, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. No single country can tackle this crisis alone. We need bold and concrete action at the global level. We need multilateral cooperation to fulfill our promises to UN 75 declaration to build a more equal and inclusive world. Let me highlight a few specific points in this regard. First, the most urgent call of the hour is to eliminate vaccine divides between the rich and the poor. Second, we need a new paradigm that will address inequality in a holistic manner. It has deep relations with the SDGs, such as poverty, hunger, gender equality, health, education, and job creation. Third, we must address the special financing needs of the most vulnerable countries, which include the LDCs, climate vulnerable countries, etc. Fourth, it is imperative to address the vulnerabilities of migrants and people on the move. Fifth, we need to bridge the stark digital divides to ensure equal opportunities for all in this evolving digital age. Finally, we must create more opportunities for women and girls to act as a real change makers in our society. I thank you all.
Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, chers participants, c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je prends part à cet important événement. Plus d'un an après, la pandémie de Covid-19 continue d'accentuer une crise socio-économique sans précédent, en particulier au détriment des femmes, des jeunes et des personnes âgées ou vivant avec un handicap. Les mesures restrictives mises en œuvre pour contrer la maladie ont aggravé les inégalités des sexes et exposé davantage les femmes et les filles confrontées à une détérioration de leurs revenus ainsi qu'à la hausse de la violence à leur égard. Cette situation de précarité est aussi vécue par les enfants, notamment en termes de décrochage scolaire, de prise en charge de leur santé, sans omettre les abus sexuels et le travail forcé. À toutes ces catégories de personnes vulnérables, nous devons accorder une attention particulière. Cette attention requiert pour nous d'allier aux mesures socio-économiques ciblées l'universalité d'une couverture sanitaire. Au Sénégal, le président Macky Sall a inscrit la riposte face à la Covid-19 dans cette dynamique, en allouant des ressources conséquentes au renforcement du système de santé ainsi qu'à la résilience économique et sociale, en engageant une vaste campagne de vaccination. Enfin, en travaillant à doter l'Institut Pasteur de Dakar d'une unité de production de vaccins à vocation continentale. Tout ceci pour réaffirmer l'engagement soutenu de notre pays dans la riposte post-Covid en relation avec l'agenda commun. C'est pourquoi, et pour ce qui le concerne, le Sénégal appelle à ce qu'une attention soit accordée aux pays en développement et plus particulièrement aux pays les moins avancés.
We heard today from a wide range of countries, from Sweden to Costa Rica to Sierra Leone to Bangladesh to Spain to Senegal to New Zealand. We heard from public figures like Forrest Whitaker and Jose Andres, from civil society leaders such as Winnie Byanyima and Mark Malloch Brown, academics like Nobel Prize winning Professor Joseph Stiglitz. I had 4 takeaways from what they said. The first is just how wide the gap of inequality and exclusion really is. We heard that Sierra Leone is struggling to vaccinate 1% of its population, while much of the rich world has vaccinated more than 70% already. That the wealth of the world's billionaires increased dramatically during the pandemic, while 120 million people were thrown into poverty. Second, we heard how common are the issues. Prime Minister Levine, Prime Minister Sanchez, President Bio, President Alvarado, Prime Minister Ardern, Prime Minister Hasina, all talked about, although they are from very different countries, along with President Higgins of Ireland, all talked about the grievances people have when they feel that they do not belong, and how the need for a new social contract, which gives people hope that everyone is benefiting from their place in society and everyone is contributing fairly, applies across all these countries. Of course, they must find their own path, and today we launched a menu of options which gives the evidence for solutions that work, that countries can adapt to their own circumstances. Third, the solutions are indeed in our hands. We have the evidence on what we need in terms of visible results, solidarity building, and securing trust and credibility. And we heard from countries about what they are doing in terms of providing people with educational opportunities, decent jobs and protections in the care economy, access to housing, access to digital connectivity, all of the things that make a difference in people's daily lives. We heard about what countries are doing in solidarity building, whether that's reforming their institutions, such as their police and justice systems, to be more trusted, or whether it's having national dialogues to bridge the divides that have so polarized our societies. And we heard about the importance of addressing corruption and tax avoidance to make sure that everyone feels that progress and development is fair going forward. Fourth, action is truly urgent. The title of the report we launched today is From Rhetoric to Action, and that is what we heard today. We need action, and we need it now. On national priorities, delivering those visible results for people's lives, building solidarity across divides, addressing corruption and trust, and on international policies, we heard that we really still need a global vaccine plan, and that we need action on financing, access to liquidity and debt relief for countries that otherwise will be forced to cut services, risking social unrest. I want to close by thanking all of our co-signatories and co-sponsors, Costa Rica, Sierra Leone, Spain and Sweden, those who supported the work, including Canada, Sweden and the Open Societies Foundations, the Institute Cervantes for hosting with us, our wonderful civil society and multilateral partners such as Oxfam, the UN, the Open Government Partnership, the World Bank and Civicus. It's the work of all of these countries and partners that has brought us to this menu of practical options that we were able to present today for action. And to translate that into something that really makes a difference in people's lives, it will need all of us to work together going forwards. I thank you very much for this discussion.